The laws of nature are the laws that, according to Blackstone's commentaries, that is the revelation of God that he gives through nature. This is what you find in Romans 1:19 and 20, where Paul says there's not anything you can know about God that you can't see through what he's created. Paul says even the intricacies of the Godhead, you can see through the creation. You look at Job. When God revealed himself to Job in chapter 38, he said, Job, haven't you ever paid attention to the way the ostrich does this, or the way the sea does this on the shore, or the way the frost does this at certain times, or haven't you ever given any thought to Leviathan or Behemoth? He just took him back to nature. That's why Psalms 19 verses 1 through 7 says, there is not a place you can go on this world. There's nowhere you can be that you can't see the handwriting of God because it's written across the heavens. There is absolutely no excuse. And that's what, again, Paul says in Romans 1:19 and 20. He says, even the heathen are without excuse because of what God has shown them through creation. Now, that is the laws of nature. We can use the laws of nature to say abortion is a violation of the law of nature. There is not a species in nature that kills its young while it's still in the womb. You see, this is what the founders looked at. They said, if you look at what God has created, you can tell what's right and wrong even through that. But this law book, Blackstone's Commentaries, after talking about the laws of nature, it talked about the laws of nature's God. It says, now, our mind is not always clear. We don't always understand the revelation of God clearly. We can look at nature and come up with different conclusions, which is why God has given us written revelation in the Scriptures. They call that the revealed law. That was the law of nature's God. That was the law of the God who created nature. So in the Declaration of Independence, when it uses those 8 words, the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God, they're saying, look, whether you just look at what God's made through creation or whether you look at the divine Scriptures, what we're doing is justified under either of God's revelations, that of natural law or that of revealed law. They never contradict each other. And so that's a very strong spiritual declaration. And again, the founders wrote on that. They made it very clear it is not the Enlightenment deism that people today try to attribute it to. You read it out of their own writings. You read it out of the legal books of that day. That's a very compelling declaration. But at this point, people say, now wait a minute. This is called the American Revolution. Romans 13 says you're to submit to authority. How can you say that God blessed this nation if it was birthed in revolution? That is rebellion against God. God can't bless a nation that does that. Well, you have to understand first off that the Founding Fathers did not call it the American Revolution. It was called that in later years. At that point in time, it was called a civil war. And as they point out, they didn't start it. Matter of fact, we took great pride in the fact that we never fired the first shot. We never sent troops to attack Great Britain. We, as British citizens living in America, were attacked by British troops, by British forces, bombarded by British ships. The Americans, they did not have an army, they did not have a navy, but they did have the biblical right to defend themselves. And that was one of the inalienable rights, by the way, that the Founding Fathers put in the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. They pointed that in the Scriptures, and you can see that throughout Nehemiah. Nehemiah, what did he do when he was rebuilding the city of Jerusalem? He stationed them with a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. You have the right to defend yourself if you're attacked. We didn't create a revolution. As a matter of fact, the British opened fire on the Americans in 1770, what was called the British Massacre. And then if you look, or the Boston Massacre, British massacred those in Boston. Then you start looking into 1774 and 1775, and here we haven't signed a Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, the states at that time were opposed to severing their relationship with Great Britain. They wanted to stay British citizens. But you'll find that in 1774, British sent its navy, Great Britain, the British troops arrived here with their navy to blockade Boston, to start opening fire on Boston. You'll find the burning of Charleston, the bombardment of Boston, the Battle of Breed's Hill or Bunker's Hill, Lexington, Concord, the Battle at Williamsburg. All of these things went on before we were even signing the Declaration of Independence. These were British forces attacking British citizens in America. So this was not a revolution. We weren't trying to have anarchy. As a matter of fact, if you look at what the founders themselves said, now, when you look at this picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the 56 signers of the Declaration, the guy on the back row over toward the left side, you see him wearing a hat. He is the only man in that picture who is wearing a hat. He's Stephen Hopkins. He is the governor of Rhode Island. Now, he wears that hat because he's a Quaker. He's a Quaker Christian, and Quakers were by their nature pacifist. I mean, these weren't warrior-type people. Stephen Hopkins is a Quaker, and even Stephen Hopkins signed the Declaration of Independence, and listen to what he said. He says, "These colonies are made up of pious Christians who are faithful subjects of the King. We have honestly obeyed every royal command and cheerfully submitted to every constitutional law. We have carefully avoided every offensive measure. We have kept due order. We've supported a regular government. We've maintained peace. We've practiced Christianity. And in all conditions and in every relation, we have demeaned ourselves as loyal, as dutiful, and as faithful subjects should." But he signed the Declaration of Independence. He said, we have done everything right, and we've been attacked for doing it. John Witherspoon, also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a minister of the gospel, Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, Presbyterian minister. He said this. He said, on the part of America, there was not the most distant thought of subverting the government or of hurting the interest of the people of Great Britain, but only of defending our own privileges from unjust encroachment. There was not the least desire of withdrawing our allegiance from King George III till it became absolutely necessary, and indeed it was his own choice. You see, the Americans were willing to work peacefully with Great Britain to resolve differences. And there were a whole lot in the British Parliament that said our cause was right, our side was right. You had Edmund Burke, who strongly sided with the Americans, but King George III became real belligerent. He bowed up and he said, I'll show you, I'll make you bow your knee, like the Nebuchadnezzar approach. And he sent troops to force us to submit. Now, it's interesting that months before we signed the Declaration of Independence, we had sent King George III the olive branch petition. And it says, we in Congress humbly implore your help. We want to serve you. We want to be subservient to you. We want to be good, obedient subjects. We just need you to change a few simple policies here that we feel are very clear scriptural violations. And it was called the olive branch petition. How did King George III respond to the olive branch petition? He sent more armed troops to America. He says, I'll show you how you're going to submit. I'm going to break you. So it was at that time, after we had been trying peaceful negotiations for 11 years. Now remember, this started back in 1765 with the Stamp Act. And Benjamin Franklin and others went to Great Britain and were able to gain concessions, and so they repealed the Stamp Act, but then they came back with other prohibitory acts, etc. For 11 years, we've been negotiating over these principles, and finally, King George III says, I don't negotiate. You are going to bow your knee, and he sent these troops. So it was not a revolution in that sense. As a matter of fact, there's some great statements here. Here's one by Sam Adams. Sam Adams wrote this to the British government. Now, Sam Adams, signer of the Declaration, a member of Congress, he wrote this to the British officials. He said, you know that the cause of America is just. He said, the blood of the innocent is upon your hands. We again make our solemn appeal to the God of heaven to decide between you and us. And we pray that in the doubtful scale of battle, we may be successful as we have justice on our side, and that the merciful Savior of the world may forgive our oppressors. And that's not anarchy. That's not rebellion. I mean, they are sincerely submitting to God and saying, we've got to stand for what's right, and we ask God to judge between us. Same thing happened with the Congress. You see, the Congress also sent out if you will, an announcement, a declaration. It says, we therefore, the Congress of the United States of America, do solemnly declare and we proclaim that we appeal to the God who searches the hearts of men for the rectitude of our intentions, and in His holy presence we declare that we are not moved by any light or hasty suggestions of anger or revenge. We're not doing this simply to have a war. We're not doing this as disobedient, rebellious. You see, there was no American Revolution per se. It was literally a civil war. We were attacked by Great Britain. We didn't go there. We didn't start the fight. We didn't shoot the first shots. But when fired upon, we did take the posture of self-defense. And so this is real clear, and that's why John Quincy Adams has a great declaration. On the 4th of July, 1821, he was addressing this very topic. Was this rebellion? Well, what happened when we celebrate the American Revolution? Are we celebrating anarchy, a rebellion against God? He said, absolutely not. This is from his speech in 1821. He said, there was no anarchy. He said, the people of the United States and of its separate states were associated bodies of civilized men and Christians in a state of nature, but not of anarchy. They were bound by the laws of God, which they all, and by the laws of the gospel, which they nearly all acknowledged as the rules of their conduct. He said, this wasn't anarchy. He said, we were all bound by the laws of God, and nearly every one of us were bound by the laws of the gospel. Now, he was part of that. He was part of what went on back in the American Revolution. I mean, John Quincy Adams, as a little boy of 8 years old, was out there marching with the Massachusetts Minutemen. There are great accounts of how he handled his musket and how he could do all the drills. So he's a participant in the things that went on back then. He said there wasn't anarchy. He said we were bound by the laws of God, nearly by all of us were, and nearly all of us by the laws of the gospel. So very clearly, what we celebrate on the 4th of July, we're not celebrating an act of rebellion. We're actually celebrating self-defense that went on in America. And you see, this spiritual tone was evident throughout the American Revolution. You go back to 1774, when we learned, or we heard in Congress, now Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, and they were told in the first week of September that Boston had been blockaded and Boston was now under attack. It was being bombarded by British ships sitting out in Boston Harbor, just bombing the dickens out of Boston. What'd they do? They went to prayer. It's recorded in the records of Congress. You can go to the public library, pull those records out. September the 7th, 1774. You'll see that they opened with prayer, and it was a significant time of prayer. As a matter of fact, so many of the Founding Fathers wrote about that time of prayer that you actually have a painting that was commissioned in 1848, but it was based on the founders' writings to do a painting on what they said happened that morning in Congress. You see, historical records indicate that opening prayer session in Congress lasted for several hours, literally. Reverend Jacob Duché, all by himself, as he was praying one time, he prayed a 10-minute prayer by himself. They said it was an extemporary prayer that went for 10 minutes, filled the bosom of every man present. John Adams said that during the prayer time in Congress, he said they studied 4 chapters of the Bible that morning in Congress. He said God so spoke to them out of one of those chapters, so built their faith that they believed for the first time that they could defeat the British. Now, that's a pretty serious faith change there, because here they are. They don't have an army. They don't have a navy. They're under attack by the world's greatest military power, and yet what they read in Congress that morning assured them that God could turn the tide on this. And so in his letter, he said, I beg you, read Psalm 35. And Psalm 35 is a powerful psalm to read in light of what they had heard happening that morning in Boston.